As I go through this talk, I'd like you to keep one question in your mind and keep that framed there throughout the talk. How do you know that the path you've pursued and the person that you've grown and cultivated is the one that's best for you? How do you know that your values, your beliefs, your goals, and the things that you pursue and surround yourself with are the ones that are going to maximize that intrinsic person inside of you? Throughout our life, but especially when we're very young in teens and 20s, we're given advice by someone that says, go out and find your true self, pursue your deep inner passions. Except, along with that advice is never, well, how do you go do that? There's never any sort of method given for what's the correct way to figure that out. Everyone's just left to do it on their own. So, how have you done that? And how sure are you that you've gone down the correct path? And keep that in mind as we go through this talk, because that's what I do as a growth cultivator. For me in my early life, I thought I had it pretty good. I knew that I wanted to be an astrophysicist in the Air Force since I was 10 years old. I wanted to know all of the deep alien secrets and where all the spaceships were being kept and all of that fun stuff. And turns out the aliens and the spaceships weren't there, but I still achieved my goal of being that astrophysicist in the Air Force. So by the time I was 25 or 26, I had my degrees, I was in the Air Force, I was doing astrophysics. As niche as my field was, I was pretty good at what I did and kind of an expert in what I was doing. So I had it pretty good. I thought I had a decent life. And that was until tragedy struck. When she was about 2 years old, my niece tragically died of an inexplicable illness. Stricken with so much grief over the loss of his daughter, my brother died about a year later, and I felt so much responsibility over his death. I wasn't there to take care of him. I wasn't there to be a brother because I was in the Air Force. I wasn't home to be able to support. And it just led to a slide downhill. That wasn't helped because my nephews then also kind of placed blame on me and my family for his death as well, and they kind of cut off contact with us, and so I lost them also. Now, not to be done yet, a few months after that, my best friend since childhood, a firefighter, was killed in a car accident. So I had just lost all of these people. And a week after that, I was reassigned to Maui Island in Hawaii, far away from the US mainland, where I had support to be able to go through this grief with my family. And so I was alone and isolated. Needless to say, this caused a huge transformation in myself. I lost my drive, my motivation, a lot of my values and personality just fell away. And I didn't know who I was or what I was going for. Except in the process of that trauma and that grief, something else happened. And after that, I became this connected, more fulfilled, more engaged person than I ever felt in my whole life. I became I converted to Buddhism. I stopped looking forward all of the time into technology in the future. Started reading books on philosophy and ancient religions and looking at what did they have to offer about what life is all about. And I made a huge switch. And just feel more connected, more fulfilled, happier in my life, more self confident in all these different ways. And over that time, since then, I've changed tracks. I have a PhD in psychology. I've taught peace studies. I got this growth cultivator job that I am working with now, talking to you about. I have degrees in conflict resolution. This is a big switch from an astrophysicist in the Air Force. But yet, I feel more fulfilled and happy. And so, ever the scientist, the reason I went into psychology is I wanted to understand why. So, how does trauma and death cause such happiness and fulfillment? Was it just me that gained from this, or is there a process here that other people experience? Why isn't everyone already like this? I mean, why do we have to go through trauma and grief in the first place to gain these type of perspectives and benefits? And thirdly, can we understand this process enough that we can attain growth without the trauma? Essentially, could we teach growth in the way that we learn from trauma? And the answer to that is a resounding yes, because there actually is a phenomenon that people go through. We've all heard of post traumatic stress disorder, but there's an opposite end too. There's a post traumatic growth when we gain from having gone through tragedy. And it's not just my experience. These stories everywhere, and we all, I'm sure, personally know people or ourselves that have been through this process at some point. And to read some quotes from other people that have been through this so you know kind of what it's like is here's one. When I got home, the sky was brighter. I paid attention to the texture of the sidewalks. It was like being in a movie. Everything is a gift. Or simply, even the simplest, smallest joys in life took on a special meaning. And I've become more empathetic toward anybody in pain and anybody in any kind of grief. Before I lived nice, cotton clean, cool, healthy. But now I live velvet, beautiful purple, magic carpet velvet. I call this my year of ecstasy. Even though my previous life was good, it was not the bliss, the splendor, the ecstasy of how I live now. Doesn't that sound great? To have that type of fulfillment, comfort with your life, that happiness, that joy in flourishing in this manner. But the question is, do you experience this day to day? You watching, do you feel this in your mundane tasks from day to day? Not saying that everybody's happy all of the time. That's not true of post traumatic growth either. But do you experience this daily, this type of deep sense of gratitude and connection with even the simplest things you do? That's what post traumatic growth gives. So if we can abstract the growth from that and figure out the process, then we can start to give it to other people. And this is what I spent 10 years doing, researching in my PhD, implementing into educational curriculums, and now doing this as a growth cultivator and doing experimentation and research. And it's built on a framework of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which I'm sure most, if not many of you, are familiar with. You'll see self-transcendence here at the top, which is actually the peak. What happens in this process is as we go through life, we get stunted at a certain point. Our growth towards self-actualization, self-transcendence gets stuck because we start gaining our self-esteem from what is essentially a self-limiting source. But we don't know it because it does give us our self-esteem. We start to feel fulfilled for that particular need, but it keeps us from being able to satisfy those higher level growth needs. And what post-traumatic growth does is it removes that blockage or essentially takes you around it so you can actually reach those highest potentials and flourish as a human being to find those intrinsic potentials and maximize them, to actualize them. Now, incidentally, this is also where my company logo comes from. It's both going up Maslow's hierarchy towards flourishing, but then also a path and a journey towards it. And it's because it's so important to the process to understand this. Okay, you might be saying, all right, that all sounds wonderful and good, but how does that relate to real life and what's going on? Well, this has real effects on people and the way that they live their life and their personality traits and the things that they focus on. The research shows that people that focus on the extrinsic means, that's the way we don't really want to go, we see increased greed and narcissism, fear of difference, higher mental instability in terms of stress, anxiety, depression. We have less self confidence, less adaptable to change, whole bunch of negative side effects to this. But if you focus on the intrinsic side, if your self esteem is coming from there and you really flourish, we see the opposite. You're more altruistic, self confident, mental stability is increased, higher adaptability, more compassionate. Those are the things we want. Those are the people we ought to want to be. And so, are we pursuing that in the way that's going to get us there in our practical goals and what we're striving for? Because we want that self confidence, right? We want to be happy, don't we? That's why we're doing everything. And that is what the growth cultivation process provides. Because we don't want to force people to go through trauma to make this change happen. We want to give a guided process that's going to get them to where they need to be. So that's what I've researched. That's what I've worked on is what does that process look like and how do we get there? All right, so maybe you're still not convinced. Why should I care? Who cares if we're more compassionate and altruistic? How does that get me to practical outcomes? Well, the traits that I just listed are also related to leadership success and productivity. Higher self confidence in what you're going to do. Your professional relationships are improved, and your ability to see talents in other people to connect with them. You're more adaptable to unpredictable changes, very important in leadership. You're much more self-motivated to pursue your intrinsic goals once they've been identified. And we know that risk taking is an important part of success. Those that aren't willing to take risks really don't usually stand out that much. So, all of these things that we know are important to cultivating the best person we can be are all enhanced when we go through this process. We find those intrinsic motivations that we're looking for, those intrinsic self esteem drivers. Now, a lot of those outcomes that I just said, you might say, hey, this sounds a lot like life coaching, or is it approaching therapy, or where does this fall in between them? And it's definitely neither of those. It falls somewhere outside of both. A growth cultivator is very unique in what it does. So, whereas a life coach typically focuses on clients that give them a specific set of goals and then helps them figure out how to get to those goals in the end, what a growth cultivator does is they focus on actualizing intrinsic potentials regardless of what your goals are. Because once we go through the process, we might figure out that your goals suck for you and you need to figure out a new direction and new goals. That is a very possible outcome and a likely outcome. Not in everything, it might not mean a radical change like I had, but shifts in your perspectives and values and goals might end up being a result of this process. Because what we are doing in there is transforming your self esteem to help you climb Maslow's hierarchy in whatever ways you've been stunted up until now. That's very different than what a life coach does and a therapist who tends to focus on crises and stabilization. We're not stabilizing, we're taking you beyond where you've been. And now we need to remove those extrinsic stuntings and identify the intrinsic motivations, which are going to be unique to you. Everybody's got unique motivations. So we need to find them and help actualize them. And kind of the biggest difference in a growth cultivator is that we don't shy away from negative emotions. Remember, this comes from post-traumatic growth. And while we're removing the trauma, we still need to confront things like fear and mortality and death and rejection and isolation. In fact, we need to initiate some of those feelings because we're trying to shake up that grounding that you already have so we can start to work through and find a more intrinsic person. So it's not about positivity in the process, but that's where we get to through it. And that's what we want. When I taught pieces of this in courses, the students would often call this course the crying class, which is very apt because in a lot of classes they'd be in tears because we want to get that emotionality, and they were happy tears and sad tears as well. So we need to engage with that emotionality. Now, if all this sounds good to you, please, I'm setting up a set of social media links right now that are going to start to go live very soon. So please keep up to date with those by subscribing or following here. And you can learn more. You can contact me if you're interested in going through the growth cultivation process or starting to learn more about it. I'm happy to discuss and talk to anyone about it. So please contact me whenever you would like or subscribe and follow on social media. Thank you.